Right. So in this recording, I wanted to talk about a discussion between Jean Tarrou and Dr. Rieux. To some degree, Jean Tarrou and Dr. Rieux control the narrative of this book. Um, they we sort of, if there is a lesson to be learned from this book, then I think it comes from their perspective. Right. So this is instructive that they're both having a discussion. They'll have another one later in the book, which will also be pretty interesting. Okay, so at this point, this is the chapter that's in the that begins on page 122. So Jean Taru visits Dr. Rieux at home, and he offers to help Dr. Rieux, who is helping supervise the whole effort against the plague. So the town has been quarantined. There's a lot of problems, and it's just been hell for them. And so Jean Taru offers to help create um, what are called sanitation teams. Okay? So he offers to create sanitation teams. Right. So these are people who are going to help the sanitation department and basically, just do whatever needs to be done. All right. So this is very generous, and it's needed. And of course, the doctor says, "I will gladly accept." But then Dr. Ryu has to ask the question, which I think all of us would ask. So think of it this way: we don't think of the plague as much these days because it's not a problem. But back in that time, the plague was deadly, was fatal. So you can think of something these days, maybe Ebola or something like that. Let's say there was an Ebola outbreak, um, and someone offered to help. Now you realize, I mean, this in this case, this is pretty dangerous, and if you're offering to assist in a very infectious disease, then you're putting yourself at risk, especially at a time when they didn't have the same kind of protocols and precautions we have today. So Dr. Ryu asks on page 125, says, "I accept um, your offer to help, but," he says, and I quote, "but I take it you know that work of this kind may prove fatal to the worker," right? So, this is dangerous work. Okay, you might die. In fact, it's you'll likely die. Let me rephrase that. So he says, "but I take it you know that work of this kind may prove fatal to the worker. And I feel I should ask you this: have you weighed the dangers?" So here is Dr. Ryu's question: have you weighed the dangers? Again, later he's going to phrase it as consequences. Okay, so let's just put that here. So have you weighed the dangers? Have you weighed the consequences? That's another way of asking, are you prepared to die? Okay, so that's really what he's asking, is that you want to help with this problem. If you do it, you're likely to get infected. If you get infected, you're likely to die. All right, so Jean, that's a fairly straightforward question. Have you weighed the dangers of your actions? So this is sort of thing that would require, it would prompt a simple yes or a simple no. But Taru doesn't answer, and he says, and here's his response. He says, "What did you think of Father Pinalu's sermon?" So that's his response. His response is to evoke Father Pinalu's sermon. Now, if you recall, Father Pinalu's sermon was this blistering sermon, but it was about how God had allowed the plague, and how in this darkness of the plague, of suffering, we can experience some sort of hope, and we can see a light in flickering in this darkness, and good can come out of this because people, become changed and become more humble and um, live better lives. So he says, so Jean Tarot asks, "What do you think of the sermon?" And so Dr. Ryu responds, he says, "I've seen too much of hospitals to relish in the idea of collective punishment." Right, so what does he mean here by collective punishment? So that's really this idea that the people, the whole town has somehow sinned, and God is punishing the whole town. So um, if the town of Iran had was sinful, essentially because people, right, a lot of people were doing things that God didn't like, then the whole town's going to get punished, right, regardless of who's in the town or not, whether they're personally liable for or responsible for whatever sins they may have committed, other people may have committed. So this is Dr. Ria's response. He says, I've seen too much of hospitals to relish an idea of collective punishment. So what's he saying there? He's saying essentially that suffering is an individual, excuse me, phenomenon. Like the idea of collective punishment, that God is going to punish all the people for the sins of all the people, didn't make sense to him, right? He has been in hospitals and had to deal with individuals who are suffering, right? So the idea of a collective punishment didn't make sense to him. He goes on to say, however, but yeah, as you know, Christians sometimes say that sort of thing without really thinking it. They're better than they seem, right? So yes, this is a very sort of Christian type idea that God will punish the people. You see that sort of thing in the Bible. Um, Even the idea of original sin, right, is that one person's sin affects everyone. Okay, so Dr. Rhea says, well, I can't really think of things that way. I just see individual people suffering. But Jean Taru is not ready to let this go. And he says, no, but he says, you are, so you, he's talking to Dr. Rieux, are like Father Panelu, right? And in what ways he saying they're alike? He says he thinks that they're alike in the sense that um, they both see good coming from evil slash suffering. Okay, so I'll read what he says. However, you think like Panelu that the plague has its good side. It opens men's eyes and forces them to take thought. Right. So Father Panelu felt the plague humbled people and they became better. Dr. Yu feels that yeah, the plague makes people sort of rise above themselves, and just like Jean Taru is doing, right, he's offering his services, even though it's going to be dangerous. Well, Dr. Ryu's response is that, well, so does every ill that the flesh is heir to. What is true of all the evils in the world is true of the plague as well. It helps men to rise above themselves, right? So, one general thought here is that in this book, the plague is a metaphor. And what exactly it's a metaphor for is unclear, at least to me. But in this case, it's a metaphor for evil, right? So he says, let's say, all the evils of the world. Right, so the idea here is that what is true of all the evils of the world is true of the plague. And whenever there is suffering, people rise above themselves. So, yes, he sees good come from evil. He goes on to say, all the same, when you see misery, the misery it brings, you'd be a madman or coward or stone blind to give him tamely to the plague. Right? So, just because the plague, good can come from suffering, doesn't make suffering good. Okay, so that's really where he's going with this. All right, so Ryu goes back and says, look, you haven't answered my question yet. Have you weighed the consequences? All right, so again, he's back to the question of have you weighed the consequences, right? Have you thought about what this would mean for you if you create a sanitation team? All right, so here's Jean Taru's response again, evading the question. Or maybe not. He says, do you believe in God? All right, so um, so Dr. Rieux again takes the bait and says, yeah, I'm going to answer this. And so his response is no, he doesn't. But then he says something interesting. He says, but what does that really mean? I'm fumbling in the dark, struggling to make something out. but I've long since found out original. So he's not really sure what that means to say he doesn't believe in God. Right? He's basically just fumbling in the dark, just trying to make sense of something. Right? So the question itself for him is something of a mystery, which is an interesting point. Right? So he wants to say no, he doesn't. But even then, he's kind of aware that there's something wrong with that response, that the response itself is lacking any definition. Right? And so, he's just like, no, I don't, but I'm not clear what that means. And then Jean Tarrou says, isn't that it? That's the difference between Painolu and you. And so here we see Dr. Rieux draw a distinction between himself and Father Painolu. So ordinarily, we might think, right, we might consider Father Painolu as the man of faith, and we might think Dr. Rieux is, say, the man of reason / science. Okay, but Dr. Rieux doesn't actually make this distinction, doesn't see it this way. Dr. Rieux sees the distinction in terms of the experience of death versus little of experience with death. So I think you can say of or with death. That's the relevant distinction for Dr. Rieux, right? So when John Tarrou says, isn't that it, the gulf between Painolu and you? He says, I doubt it. Now he says Painolu is a man of learning. So notice he doesn't use his title, and he says Painolu is a man of learning, right? So the primary identification of Father Painolu here is not that he's a man of faith. That's interesting, right? He doesn't say that. For him, that's in a category that's relevant right now. He says Father Painolu is a man of learning. Okay, that means he's educated so in, let's say, the schools, right, in theory. Right, so this is someone who has studied theory, is logical, is erudite, and has impressive educational credentials. He's a man of learning. He's a scholar, right? But he hasn't come in contact with death. That's why he can speak with such assurance of the truth with a capital T, right? So that's how he's categorizing Father Painolu. He's a man of learning, educated, but no contact with death. Okay? Now, he describes himself, Dr. Rieux then describes himself, and he equates himself to not to equate himself, but he puts himself, I'm just going to say, puts himself in the same category as a country priest. And what is similar about both of them, he says, but every country priest who visits his parishioners and has heard a man gasping for breath on his deathbed thinks as I do. Right? So he now has said, look, I'm not like Father Painolu, and he doesn't describe him as a man of faith, but describes him as a man who has very little experience with death. And he says, I am, on the other hand, like a country priest, right, who visits his parishioners and heard a man gasping for breath on his deathbed, and he thinks as I do. He had tried to relieve human suffering before trying to point out its excellence, right? So anyone who has experienced death or suffering would think in terms of suffering as an individual phenomenon. So before you before you think of the good that can come, you're more interested in relieving suffering. So first impulse is to relieve suffering. Okay, so unlike Father Painolu, who thinks suffering thinks of suffering in terms of this collective type of punishment, Dr. Rieux and the country priest, right, would want to relieve the suffering of individuals first. All right, so at this point, Dr. Rieux says, well, it's clear you don't want to answer this question, so let's just drop the whole thing. All right, so Jean Tarrou says, all right, well, let me ask you this question. He says, my question's this. Why do you yourself show such devotion, considering you don't believe in God? I suspect your answer may help me to mine. So it's an interesting question. So Jean Taru is saying, um, okay, why show such devotion if you don't believe in God? So it's an interesting question, and questions so we can ask why exactly is he asking this? Um, there could be a number of reasons. One I could think of is um, the notion of God. So the idea of God being a final judge, right, who rewards good and punishes evil, right, can inspire people to do good, right? So if you think about it, when you're alone, no one's watching you. Um, there's no incentive necessarily to do good if no one will ever know, right? But if you believe in God and you think God's going to reward you for doing good, then you might have an incentive to do what you believe is good, right? Or in the case of, if in this case where you might die doing good, then you believe your reward is going to be with God in heaven or something like that. So that might, in that way, you're prepared to be a martyr. You're prepared to die, right? Um, Doing something or suffering, right? You're prepared to suffer and die, even though you don't gain anything on this earth because you believe God will reward what you do. Okay, so that'll be um, one way to look at that question. So it's saying anyway, like, why do you show such devotion if you don't believe in God? If you can answer that, then that would help me answer my question. All right, so I'll take up Dr. Rieux's response to Jean Taru in the next video.